Welcome to A Considered Life. I'm Dr. Jerome Thomas Bridges. In this first ever video, I want to explain the title of the channel and the purpose of the channel. The title of the channel comes from a few years ago. I had a former student who was applying for a job, and their head of department was calling me to ask me, because we're a conservative theological school, they were calling to ask me if this person was a professor in their philosophy department, how would they handle objections coming from the students? You know, a lot of people think that those who are theologically conservative are also these closed-minded dogmatists. And my response to her was that this person was probably one of the most considerate people I've ever known. Considerate in the sense that he was extremely polite. He didn't raise an objection to his position. He would genuinely consider their position. So that's where the title comes from. These ideas of polite discourse, civil discourse, and contemplation, actually considering the ideas of those who either agree or disagree with you. Now, the goal for the channel is that as we pursue ideas in a contemplative way, it starts with consideration and contemplation, and it ends with personal and spiritual growth. In this first ever video, I want to talk about consideration itself. And what we'll see is that consideration has different facets. There's consideration of theory, consideration of practice, consideration as it plays a role in the virtue of wisdom. And then finally, we'll ask the question, when is consideration bad? And then we'll bring it more into a biblical context. But to start out, I wanted to look at this clip from Matt Walsh. It comes from his documentary, What is a Woman? And it's his interaction with this gender studies professor. And it sort of sets the table for some of the things
about gender and sex, and there's a lot of controversies there. If we're talking about a trans woman, has all of the male physical characteristics, so would that not be a male then? Couldn't we plainly say this person is a male?
Well, I guess it's like, why are you asking the question? I think I want to understand sort of why that's so important. So if someone tells you...
Just to sort of understand reality, you know?
Well, I mean, I think when someone tells you who they are, you should believe them. So if a person says that they're a woman or they're a man, then that's them telling you their gender is. I'm not so sure what social interactions would have to do with maleness or femaleness that would.
Well, I'm not even talking about social context. I'm just trying to start by getting to the truth, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I'm really uncomfortable with that language of like getting to the truth again.
Okay, I wanted to look at that clip because Matt says a couple things in dealing with this professor that I think are a good place to start as we are moving through life and asking questions about important issues like gender or human sexuality. And the first thing he asks, he says, I want to get to understand reality. I want to get at the truth. This is what we're going to call consideration of theory. Now, consideration of theory answers two questions. It answers, what is it? What is its nature? What is a woman? When you say woman, what do you mean? And then, is that true? Do my beliefs correspond with reality? Now, Aristotle has this very good starting point where he asks, what is it? What is its nature? What is the essence of the thing under discussion? And then further, is it true? Do my beliefs about this thing or this issue or topic, do they correspond with reality? That's a good place to begin a contemplative position on a subject. And in Acts 17, we read this. Now the Bereans were of more noble character than the Thessalonians. If you go earlier into Acts 17, you'll see that when Paul was at Thessalonica, the Thessalonians, when they heard his message, basically stirred up a mob to run him out of town. Then they go to Berea. And the Bereans are of more noble character, for they received the message with great eagerness and examined the scriptures every day to see if what Paul said was true. This is a valued contemplative approach to a theological issue. Paul is saying some things about our Old Testament, their scriptures, and their response is to be considerate. They think about what he says, and then they test his theological position against their holy scriptures. It's praised. This attitude is praised in Acts. Now, not only is consideration of theory, but there's also what we're going to call consideration of practice. This answers the question, what should I do? It doesn't ask the question, what is its nature, or is it true, but it asks, what should I do? This question does not reason about the truth of the idea, but about the rightness of an action. And further, every individual action must be identified as falling under a general principle. Now, we see this in Scripture when Jesus is discussing the nature of forgiveness or adultery or murder. He actually locates lust as a species of adultery. He locates hatred as a species of murder, right? And so, whereas the Ten Commandments clearly spell out, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery. But then people were okay with lusting after their neighbor's wife or hating their brother in their heart. And what the Lord does is he situates these more sort of remote sins like lust under a more general principle of adultery. He locates the hatred of a brother underneath the more general principle of murder. And so he brings these sort of internal, maybe threshold cases under a more explicit general legal code, and then forbids or condemns them. Now, consideration plays a role in wisdom, prudence. Now, the ancient Greeks had the four virtues: wisdom, justice, courage, temperance. We added to those the theological virtues, largely in the Middle Ages, faith, hope, and love. And so that, you've heard of the 7 deadly sins. Well, there are also the 7 virtues, the 4 cardinal virtues from Greek tradition, and then the addition of the Christian theological virtues. Well, when we go back to the virtue of wisdom, we see that consideration is the first moment of wisdom. So consideration asks the question, we said, what should I do? Then there's judgment is the second moment of wisdom. I should do X, or I should not do X. Should I lust? No, lust is a species of adultery, so I should not lust. Then don't lust. And that last part is decision. Then do that or don't do that, right? So that's consideration of theory, consideration of practice. Now the question becomes, if consideration is the first moment of the virtue of wisdom, then when is consideration bad? And this is where we're going to tether this more contemplative starting point to a biblical analysis, which will hopefully end in some sort of personal and spiritual growth. All the way back in Genesis, we see the serpent says this. The serpent said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? God knows that when you eat of it, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, your eyes will be open and you will be like God." Now, my wife and I watch a lot of YouTube, but I was just watching some the other day, and they remarked on Adam and Eve in the garden, and they remarked on the first temptation, the temptation of the fruit to be eaten. And my perspective is this, that even though eating the fruit was the first sin, it wasn't the first mistake, because Eve makes a prior mistake that leads to her sin. And we'll tether the Old and New Testament to this in a minute. It says, "The woman saw that the fruit was good for food and pleasing to the eye, and also desirable for gaining wisdom. She took some and ate it." Okay, my background is in theology and philosophy, so this channel will occasionally have some little philosophical asides, and this is one of them. The meaning of the term good. The term good is actually not, it's what we call an analogous term. We have to understand the difference between a good apple, a good knife, and a good policeman, say, right? Being a good apple means it's not filled with worms. It's not rotten. Being a good knife means it's sharp and it can cut. And being a good policeman means being a good agent of the government to uphold the laws in a fair and equitable manner, right? But a good apple is not one that cuts, right? So the good of something is follows on the nature of the thing, and this is where some of our natural law ethics emerge. But besides that, the goods are in a hierarchy. There can be moral goods, which is of itself right action. It leads us into and a development of the virtues. There's pleasurable goods of pleasure that please the 5 senses of the body and sometimes the mind, like say mathematical equations. And then there's useful good. A sharp knife is not a pleasurable or moral good, but it is a useful good. A dull knife is useless, right? Or a broken knife is useless, but a sharp knife is a useful good. So we can say good in all these different ways. But there's a hierarchy of goods, and the hierarchy starts at the very top is the moral good. So what we see is that immoral action occurs when a lower good, a good of utility or pleasure, is pursued over a higher good. You may kill grandma in order to get your inheritance, and you'll get money, which is a useful good, but you're a murderer, which is immoral, right? So don't kill grandma. But this makes sense of what is going on in Genesis, because when it says, when the woman saw the fruit was good for food and pleasing the eye, that's a pleasurable good, and also desirable for gaining wisdom, that's a good of utility, a useful good. She took some and ate it, even though God had clearly forbidden it. And this brings us to our title question: when is consideration bad? Consideration is bad when we consider or contemplate or deliberate over what God has already clearly said. Remember, consideration is the first moment of wisdom. Ask the question, what should I do? You know? And there are murky cases where you don't know what you should do. And this is where you turn to the word, you go to prayer, you ask wise individuals for advice, you know. But when we deliberate or contemplate over what God has clearly said, we are setting the stage for sin. Eve's first mistake, not her first sin. The first sin was actually breaking the command. But Eve's first mistake, and what the devil tempted her to, was to give consideration, deliberation to an action that God had clearly said, do not do it. God had clearly already forbidden this action. And yet, the first temptation was for her to take upon herself the autonomy of deliberating over what God had already clearly forbidden. And this is also a key mistake that we make as Christians. When temptations seize us, and sometimes it's really strong, ultimately our own deliberation and will is responsible for our action. The devil can't make you do anything, but he can definitely tempt you to do things. And the first thing he tempts you to do often is to deliberate over what God has clearly said. Adultery, lying, theft, fits of rage, murder. These are things that God has already clearly forbidden. You know, it says the man's wrath does not bring about the righteous life that God desires. Right? So this brings us from the Old Testament in Genesis to the New Testament in James 1. He says this: each one is tempted when by his own evil desire he is dragged away and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. When we linger over a decision that God has clearly forbidden, we are doing nothing other than giving Satan a foothold. So this is where we want to rightly understand the nature of consideration itself. We saw Matt Walsh's documentary. We saw the quote from Acts 17 and the Bereans. It is lauded in Scripture that we think about what we do. We think about the theological claims, the claims about reality, scientific claims, cultural claims, historical claims. Thinking about them is a good thing. Consideration of theory. Is it true? What is its nature? Is it true? Then, having deliberated, then what should I do about it? Right? So those are those aspects of consideration that are laudable. Consideration of theory, consideration of practice, consideration's first moment in the virtue of wisdom. But when it comes to things that God has clearly ordained or forbidden, lingering over a decision that clearly falls under a more general principle of love or lust, charity or hatred, right? God has already clearly spoken on these things. And our job is simply to bring our will into alignment with what God has clearly already said. And that's where deliberation gets us into trouble. Now, I said that this channel, A Considerate Life, is dedicated to consideration. It's dedicated to consideration of theory. What is it? Is it true? So we'll often be starting by asking, what is the nature of the thing? As we focus on reality, reality is an extremely rich area of discussion and discovery. And as we become more and more connected with reality, more and more of our beliefs about reality by their very nature are true. They become more true and more consistent. They become more clear in that way. And clear thoughts lead to more and more consistent right action. So that's the connection between consideration of theory and consideration of practice. Given what is true and real, then what do I do, right? Now, all of that sets the stage for what we're going to talk about next time. I constantly hear this idea of being my true self, being my authentic self. And I want to explore in the next video, what does that mean? What does it mean for someone to be their authentic self? And I found this quote from Carl Jung, and it's provocative. He says, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls." So in the next video, we're going to initially talk about taking the courageous step to examine the state of one's own soul. So that'll be next time.